Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this GCSE Chemistry online school session. My name is Aman, and today I'm leading the GCSE Chemistry session on biological extraction and life cycle assessments. So if you were here last week, you'll know that we started the topic of the Earth's resources and we looked at wastewater treatment. So we'll be carrying on with that today, moving on from wastewater onto biological extraction and life cycle assessments. This session will last for 1 hour, so it will be from 2 p.m. until 3 p.m. And as usual, if you have any questions at all or any comments to make, please pop them into the Q&A or the chat box function and I will answer them. There is a quiz, we'll be doing that in just a second. I hope you've all had a lovely week, as I said, and to all the people that have gone back to school, I hope that's been a smooth transition. So if you haven't met me before, my name's Aman and I study medicine at King's College London. I've done plenty of lessons with MyTutor and I've done all the GCSE Chemistry online school sessions, which should all be up on YouTube if you've missed any of them. So today then, our learning objectives are to know the two methods of extracting copper from high-grade ores, describe and explain biological methods of metal extraction, and then explain the concept of life cycle assessments. So these three learning objectives are on the three main exam boards, AQA, OCR and EdExcel. So all three of them are there and I'll try and cover the content for all three as well. So before we go into today's content then, let's do a quiz testing last week's content. So as I said, we looked at wastewater treatment last week. So that's what the quiz will be testing. If you go to menti.com and you use the code 324013, you should be able to join. And as usual, if you can't join or you don't want to join, you can still take part in the quiz. You can just send me the answers through the chat or the Q&A function. So I'll just wait for a couple of you to join. So you should be able to join. So I can see someone's joined, so that's good. So I'll just wait for more of you to join. Just as a reminder of what we covered last week, because obviously it's been quite a long time now. So we were looking at potable water. So potable water means drinking water and how we get that from the two sources. So you may remember there are two sources of drinking water. You can either get that from rainwater or you can get it from seawater. In the UK, we get it from rainwater, but in other countries worldwide, they may get it from seawater if they've not got enough rainfall to cover their population. So for those of you that haven't joined yet, if you go to menti.com and use the code 324013, you should be able to join. After we looked at getting fresh water or potable water from rainwater and seawater, we looked at how we treat sewage. So sewage is water that goes down our toilets, in showers, and also coming down sinks. So any wastewater that is counted as sewage, and we looked at how we treat that. Okay, so let's start the quiz then. As I said, if any of you haven't joined yet and you'd like to join, please, you can join now or send me a message either in the Q&A or chat as we go across through the quiz questions. Okay, so the faster you answer, the more points you get. So the first question is coming up on the screen now. So what are the names of the two main processes of making potable water from rainwater? Is it sedimentation and purification, sedimentation and sterilization, filtration and sterilization, or filtration and purification? So you may remember we went through the process of getting pure water or drinking water, so potable water from rainwater, and there were two main processes involved. So that's what this question's asking for. Okay, great. So the answer is filtration and sterilization. So the reason it's not purification is because the proper word for adding chlorine to water, which is what we usually do, is sterilization. So remember, there are still molecules in there. So we call that sterilization when we add chlorine. Technically, sedimentation is one of the stages, but the main stage is filtration, where we remove all the solid particles, and then what we're left with is particles such as biological microorganisms that we kill using chlorine, and that's sterilization. Okay, the next question is coming up on the screen now. So what is the general name for purifying salty water? So you have to type the answer in here. What's the general name for purifying salty water? So this means seawater. So if we want to make fresh water from seawater, what's the general name for it? So there are two processes. I don't want the processes. I want the general name for purifying salty water. And if you think about it as the removal of salt, that might help you. Okay, so the answer is desalination. Excellent. So a lot of you have said desalination. Well done. So yeah, the answer is desalination, which literally means the removal of salt. So you remember salty water, seawater has lots and lots of sodium chloride dissolved in it. And so if we want to be able to drink it, we need to remove that salty water. So the general process of getting drinking water from salty water is known as desalination. All these processes, filtration, sedimentation, don't relate to purifying salty water. There are two processes involved when we try and get drinking water from seawater. And the two processes were distillation and reverse osmosis. So you may remember that from last week. So distillation and reverse osmosis. So they were the two processes, but the general name was desalination. So the next question, which conditions are needed for reverse osmosis to occur? So is it a high temperature and a semi-permeable membrane, a high pressure and a semi-permeable membrane, high concentration and a non-permeable membrane, or high pressure and a non-permeable membrane? So remember that reverse osmosis is the opposite of osmosis. So that's what we want to happen. And what are the conditions that are needed? Great, so the answer is a high pressure and a semi-permeable membrane. Great, so well done everyone that got that correct. So we don't need a high temperature because osmosis, the general process of osmosis, is that water will travel from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So as that both the waters, if we're thinking about a pure water and a concentrated water, we try and make them equal to each other. But in reverse osmosis, if we think about drinking water and we think about seawater, we want the water from the seawater to go into the drinking water section. But the water from the seawater is really concentrated. So we can't do osmosis because what will happen is the drinking water that's purer, the water from that will go into the seawater because that's what normal osmosis is. Water goes from a low concentration to a high concentration. So reverse osmosis is the opposite, where we get water going from a high concentration, which is seawater, into a lower concentration. And for that to occur, we need a high pressure to overcome normal osmosis so that we can do it in the backwards direction. And we also need a semi-permeable membrane. And that semi-permeable membrane allows only water to get through and nothing else. So that's why it's called semi-permeable. So well done. Okay, the next question then is on the screen now. So what does human waste tend to contain a lot of? So we're thinking about sewage now. What does human waste tend to contain a lot of? Is it toxic chemicals, fertilizers, ammonia, or nitrogen? Which of those does human waste tend to contain a lot of? So anyone that's not in the quiz, feel free to answer using the chat or the Q&A function if you'd like. Great, so the answer then is nitrogen. Excellent, well done. So toxic chemicals comes from industrial waste. So you'll remember last week we went through 3 types of wastes. We went through industrial waste, agricultural waste, and human waste. Industrial waste, so from all the big plants, and by plants I don't mean plants that grow in your garden, I mean plants as industrial sites. So where all the big machinery lies, that we call a plant. So toxic chemicals are released from those. Fertilizers and ammonia will tend to come from agricultural waste. So agricultural means farming waste, actually where we grow plants and things like that, that would be agricultural waste. Human waste tends to contain a lot of nitrogen, so we tend to excrete a lot of nitrogen. So that's one of the main compounds of sewage from human waste. Great. The next question then is on the screen. What type of digestion is carried out on the effluent from waste sewage water? So this is quite a difficult question. So if you try and remember the flowchart I showed last week, you'll remember that when we try and purify sewage, we split it into the solid and the effluent is the liquid layer. And there's a specific type of digestion that bacteria carry out on that liquid layer. And which of these do we think it is? So the answer is aerobic digestion. So aerobic digestion, which means in the presence of oxygen. That's what aerobic digestion means. If you're wondering what type of digestion occurs on the solid layer, or on the, so remember I said sewage is split into water, which is effluent, and the solid layer or the sludge layer. Anaerobic digestion, so without oxygen, occurs on the sludge, but on the water, the effluent, aerobic digestion takes place. Mechanical and chemical digestion relate to human digestion. So if you're doing biology, I'm not sure if it's still in the syllabus, but it used to be where you look at the process of digestion. Mechanical digestion relates to what we do with our teeth, so chewing, that's mechanical digestion. Chemical digestion occurs using enzymes. So we're thinking about protease enzymes, lipase enzymes, all of these enzymes that break down the food that we eat. So mechanical and chemical is related to biological digestion. Aerobic is related to sewage by bacteria. So digestion carried out by bacteria on the effluent, anaerobic on the sludge. Great. Okay, let's have a look at the leaderboard then. So thank you for everyone that took part in the quiz. I hope you enjoyed it. I think we've got a new winner today as well. So well done to our winner. Okay, so let's go on to today's content then. Someone's asking how many people are here today. We've got about 25 people here today. Okay, so extracting metals. So before we look at the biological methods of extracting metals, let's do a quick recap on how we actually extract metals. So an ore is a rock that contains a metal or metal compound, and most metals will be extracted from ores, so from rocks. Some metals are found in the earth without rocks, so gold is an example of a metal that you tend to just find in the earth, not in a rock, but most metals are found in a rock and we call that an ore. So we need to try and remove the metal from that ore. Does anyone know the difference between a high-grade ore and a low-grade ore? Does anyone know the difference between a high-grade ore and a low-grade ore? Great, excellent. So someone's saying a high-grade ore has lots of metal in it. Yep, so more metal in a high-grade ore. Excellent. So high-grade ore relates to the percentage of metal in it, and a high-grade ore will tend to have a high percentage of metal. A low-grade ore will tend to have a low percentage of metal. Excellent. Well done to those that answered that question. So let's take the example of copper, because copper is a common metal that we use that we tend to extract. So in a high-grade ore, there are two things that we can do to extract the copper from a high-grade ore. So high-grade meaning there's lots of copper in that rock. So we can add sulfuric acid, and the sulfuric acid will react with the copper to produce copper sulfate solution. And then once we've got copper sulfate solution, to get pure copper, we can do electrolysis, which I'll show you in a second, or we can do displacement with iron. In reality, what tends to happen is they'll displace with iron, and then we'll go through electrolysis so that we get the purest form of copper. So let's think about the displacement with iron. Why do we think we can use the displacement of iron to get copper from copper sulfate? What's the reason that we can use iron to displace copper from copper sulfate? Excellent. Yep, someone's saying it's higher in the reactivity series. Brilliant. So iron is more reactive than copper. And yep, I like that someone said it kicks the copper out because it's more reactive. Yep, that's how I always think about it, kicking the copper out. So if we write that out then, because we looked at displacement reactions last week, so just as a recap, copper sulfate, so copper is a Cu2 plus ion, sulfate is SO4 2 minus. So copper sulfate is just CuSO4. We then react that with iron, which is Fe. Because a displacement reaction is taking place and iron is more reactive than copper, iron is going to kick that copper out, so we end up with iron sulfate. In this case, the iron has a charge of Fe2 plus when it's an ionic metal, and sulfate is SO4 2 minus, so we just get FeSO4, and then we're left with copper. So that's the displacement reaction there. It's already balanced for you, so you don't need to balance it. It's nice and easy. So that's one way we can extract copper from copper sulfate, but it tends to be that this copper will be impure, so we tend to undergo electrolysis, which I'll show you in a second. If you also remember last week, we looked at the ionic reaction that's occurring, so writing an ionic equation. And just as a recap to show you that, The way we write that is we look at our two main metals, so that's copper and iron, and we look at the charges on the reactant and the product side. So if we look at the reactant side, copper is in an ionic compound, so it will be Cu2+. Iron is on its own as an element, so it's just Fe. There's no charge on it, it's neutral. When forming the products, iron has kicked the copper out, so it's now in an ionic compound, and therefore it's Fe2+. And the copper now has become a solid on its own, it's neutral, so it's Cu. So that's the ionic equation for what's happening in that process. It's already balanced as well. Excellent. Someone's saying, why did only 7 people take part in the quiz? I'm not sure. Only 7 people took part, but we've got 25 in the webinar. Okay, great. So that's just a recap of displacement reactions. So adding sulfuric acid is one way to extract copper. The other way we can do it is using a high temperature known as smelting. So this process is called smelting, where we add a really high temperature, and that will then get the copper or the rock to break apart so we can get the copper out of it. And it tends to produce impure copper. So again, we need to purify it using electrolysis. So let's look at this electrolysis process then. Now this is quite a complicated diagram, and I'm going to take you through it slowly. The reason I want to show you this is because I found that most textbooks on the electrolysis of copper don't explain it very well. So I'm going to try and explain it to you in a way that lets me understand it, and hopefully it will help you to understand it as well. So when we're doing the electrolysis of copper, we're usually doing it to purify copper. So we're not doing it to get copper, we're doing it to purify copper. So usually what we're doing is we've either got impure copper from smelting, or we've got copper from displacement, from a displacement reaction, and therefore it is kind of pure, but not pure enough to be used as a metal yet. So that's why we tend to do electrolysis. So it's about making pure copper. The first thing is that the cathode and the anode are not made from carbon or graphite, so inert materials, unreactive materials. Instead, they will be made from copper. And the reason we do that is so that we can maximize the amount of copper produced. So let's think about the cathode first. So the cathode is the negative electrode, and hopefully you remember when we looked at electrolysis that the negative electrode will attract positive ions. And usually when you do electrolysis, positive ions are your metal ions. But when a metal is dissolved in water, so if we imagine our copper, when we dissolve it in water, or our copper sulfate solution dissolved in water, we have hydrogen ions, and hydroxide ions from the water. So at the cathode, hopefully you remember when we're using an aqueous solution, we can either produce hydrogen from the hydrogen ions, or we produce the metal. And the way we know which one is produced is by looking at the reactivity series. And the general rule is that if a metal is more reactive than hydrogen, then hydrogen is produced at the cathode. If a metal is less reactive than hydrogen, then the metal is produced at the cathode. As it so happens, in the reactivity series, copper is less reactive than hydrogen. So what happens is copper is produced at the cathode. And specifically, if we have a look at this negative cathode here, the copper ions will go to the electrode and they will join, they will deposit there. And deposit just means that they will bind to the electrode and deposit a metal. So this is pure copper now. So we've got copper ions specifically going to that electrode, producing pure copper. So that's what's happening at the cathode. And if you want a general reminder of why that happens, if you remember, the higher up the reactivity series a metal is, the more likely it is to want to stay as an ion, or the less likely it is to want to gain electrons. So potassium is our highest metal in the reactivity series. It doesn't want to gain any electrons. It likes staying as a K+ ion. Whereas a hydrogen ion and a copper ion, hydrogen is more reactive than copper. So actually, copper is more likely to want to gain electrons. So it's about its stability. So potassium is quite stable as an ion. It likes to stay as an ion, and that's because it likes to lose its outer electron to become a potassium ion. It's very reactive. Copper's not that reactive, so it's happier to gain its electrons and become copper metal. So that's why copper is formed at the cathode. Someone is saying that you can no longer hear me. Is anyone else having that problem, or can you all hear me? Okay, so I'll just wait for a couple. Yep, so you can all hear me. That's great. Okay. If we now think about the anode, so we've thought about the cathode, we've got pure copper being produced at the cathode. At the anode, generally, you've either got hydroxide ions going or your negative ions, and in this case, it's the sulfate ions. So sulfate ions and hydroxide ions will compete at the anode, and the general rule is that if there is a complicated anion there, so complicated meaning more than one non-metal, so sulfur and oxygen is more than one non-metal, we call that a complicated non-metal, that will not be produced at the anode. Instead, oxygen will be produced from the hydroxide ions. So you tend to get oxygen. So you either get oxygen or you get a halide. So a halide, remember, is a halogen, so chlorine, iodine, and bromine. In this case, we haven't got any halides, we've got sulfate and hydroxide. So we would expect oxygen to be produced because sulfate ions will not tend to lose their electrons at the anode. Instead, the hydroxide will go to the anode and lose its electron to become oxygen. But in the case of copper electrolysis, what actually happens is that the hydroxide ions and the sulfate ions are relatively stable. So they actually stay as ions, and instead the copper that makes up the anode, so the positive electrode, will tend to lose electrons to become copper ions. So this is what this over here is showing. So this anode is slowly wearing away because the copper ions, or the copper that is there that produces that anode, will instead lose electrons to become a copper ion. And the reason for that, as it says here, is that your sulfate ions and your hydroxide ions are stable. They don't want to lose their electrons. So instead, copper will lose its electrons to become a copper ion. And that's what's happening. So you've got this nice process going on where you've got copper ions at the positive electrode producing pure copper, and then ions from the positive anode coming, so copper becoming a copper ion and then going to the cathode. So you're getting lots and lots of pure copper and nothing else produced. So that's the process of the electrolysis of copper, and that's how we get it from a high-grade ore. Now, when we've got a low-grade ore, it's very difficult to do these processes because they require a lot of energy and there's not much copper in the rocks, so there's not much point. But because we're running out of high-grade ores, we have to use low-grade ores. And so doing this process of electrolysis or displacement using iron will not give us the copper that we need, so we have to find other methods. And that's where our biological processes come in. So we're going to look at that now. I'm just going to answer some questions. Someone's saying, do you need to know the metals and non-metals off by heart? You don't. There will be a periodic table given to you in the exam. If you just remember where the split is between metals and non-metals, you should be fine. Someone's asking me, what's a halide? A halide is a halogen, so the group 7 non-metals, so fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. Someone's asking, what is an ion? Good question. An ion is a charged element, so charged meaning that it's either lost or gained electrons. The cathode is the negatively charged electrode. That's why you've got this negative symbol here. So it's a negatively charged electrode, and the anode is the positively charged electrode. Okay, great. So let's go on to the biological methods then. So does anyone know the names of the biological methods of extracting metals? There's two processes. The clue for the first one is in this picture, and the clue for the second one is in this picture over here. So they both end in ing. So any ideas? What are the names of the processes for biological extraction of metals? Good, okay, so I've got the first one then. Someone is saying phytomining, excellent, phytomining. So that is the process using plants, phytomining, okay. What about the next one? So phytomining is the first one. Any ideas for the second one? If I tell you this is bacteria, anyone got any ideas? It's not called bactomining. Good way of thinking, but it's not called bactomining. Okay, so it's called bioleaching. It's called bioleaching. Oops. So we call it bioleaching. And I'll explain why it's called that when we go through the process. So these are the two biological methods of extracting metals, specifically from low-grade ores. And the reason we do them will be explained in just a second. So let's first of all look at phytomining, which is using plants. So this is the process of phytomining on the screen now, and we'll go through it. So plants are first of all grown on soil that contains low-grade copper ores. So that means they'll be grown on the rocks that have these low grade, so low percentage of copper in them. And if you're doing biology, you'll know that plants absorb ions through their roots. So into the soil their roots go, and they will absorb ions through their roots. And what will happen is when they're grown on soil containing low-grade copper ores, they'll absorb copper ions through their roots. And then they tend to put these in their leaves, in the cells of their leaves, and they will concentrate them there. So then what we do is we burn the plants, and copper then is extracted from the ash. So what's essentially happened is the plants have taken the copper out of the rocks, they've concentrated them, and then we burn the plants so that we can get copper from the ash. But that copper is still impure. We want to make it pure. So again, like the high-grade ores where we dissolved in sulfuric acid and then did electrolysis, we still need to do that process. So the part that's been removed from this process then is the actual extraction of having to go and do mining. So where we have to use big trucks and things to mine and drill into the ground to get the ores. So we leach it, and leaching just means dissolving. So copper is dissolved in sulfuric acid. And then what's produced is called the leachate or copper sulfate. And that's when we do displacement with scrap iron, which I showed you, and electrolysis. And so it's much, much more cost effective to do electrolysis and dissolving in sulfuric acid when we've got concentrated copper. So that's why we have to use the plants to get the copper out of the low-grade ores. Okay, someone is saying that I'm using enhanced encryption. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Okay. This is a diagram of phytomining. So here's a plant grown on soil containing the low percentage of copper ore. It absorbs those copper ions, it's then burnt, and then we get the copper metal from the ash. So that's phytomining, and that's how we use plants to get low-grade, to get metals from low-grade ores. The other process, as we said, was bioleaching. So bioleaching involves bacteria. So these are just some nice photos of bacteria that I found. So bacteria will actually feed on and break down low-grade ores. So instead of absorbing the copper, what they will tend to do is they will feed on the ores and they will break them down. And when they break them down, we get the copper ions. So you tend to get these acidic solutions containing the copper ions. So the bacteria will tend to produce acidic solutions containing copper ions. So you don't need to add sulfuric acid, it will already be produced. And then we just do displacement with scrap iron and electrolysis to produce pure copper. So again, the two processes I've already shown you. Okay, someone's asking me a medicine related question. They're saying, do you need only biology? And also to get in there, is there a lot of competition? Okay, so good question. I've answered questions like these before. Some medical schools require only biology. Most medical schools actually want chemistry. So if there's one science that you must do at A-level for medicine, it's usually chemistry, surprisingly, and that's because a lot of A-level biology doesn't actually contain human biology. There is a lot of competition to get into med school, yes, and you do need some experience. You don't need it in hospitals, but I would definitely recommend getting some experience either in a care home, GP surgery, anything like that, just so you can actually see what goes on in a medical kind of atmosphere. Okay, so let's think about the advantages and disadvantages of phytomining and bioleaching then. Does anyone have any questions on either of those processes before we go into that? So remember that we use phytomining and bioleaching to extract metals from low-grade ores. Does anyone have any questions on either of those processes? Okay, someone's asking me to go back to slide 4. So that was just the names of the two processes. Okay, slide 3 was what's happening when we do copper electrolysis. Okay, so the advantages and disadvantages then. So why do we do it using plants and bacteria? Well, it reduces the need to obtain high-grade ores by mining, reducing the dust pollution and damage to habitats. So hopefully you know that when we mine, so when we drill into the earth, we have to use a lot of energy. That energy will increase the rate of global warming, it will increase atmospheric pollutants. As well as that, if we can use low-grade ores, it will reduce the need to actually get those high-grade ores, so it conserves the supplies of high-grade ores. There's less sulfur dioxide emissions. So we didn't really talk about this, but when we do smelting, which is a process of using lots and lots of energy to extract copper from high-grade ores, often sulfur dioxide is released into the atmosphere. And you may remember when we looked at atmospheric pollutants, that sulfur dioxide is a prominent atmospheric pollutant that contributes to acid rain. So if we don't do the process of smelting, we get less sulfur dioxide emissions. There is still sulfur dioxide released, and that is because in phytomining, we have to add sulfuric acid to our plants once they've been burnt, and that will release sulfur dioxide. So there is still some sulfur dioxide emissions, but much, much less than when we do smelting. It tends to be cheaper, so the bacteria and the plants are much, much cheaper to use, so it tends to be a lot cheaper. With bioleaching, there are no gases produced, so it's all natural, so there's no atmospheric pollutants, so that makes it a really good advantage of bioleaching. The disadvantages then, they're both quite slow processes. So if you think about plants, we have to wait for the plants to grow, we then have to burn them and then extract them from the ash. So it's a really long process. Same with the bacteria, we have to wait for it to break down those low-grade ores. So it's a very, very slow process. When we burn our plants, carbon dioxide is released. So remember, burning basically means using oxygen and using a fuel, which releases carbon dioxide and water. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and an atmospheric pollutant. And energy is still needed for electrolysis. So electrolysis still occurs. So we still have to carry out the electrolysis to get purified copper or any other metal. So electrolysis still occurs, and that still requires a lot of energy. Are there any other advantages or disadvantages anyone can think of, or does anyone want to say anything about that? Someone's saying, does the copper ore stay as copper sulfate? No, so the copper ore will then either undergo so once we've got it as copper sulfate, we will either do displacement with iron to then make copper on its own. So the iron will kick the copper out of the copper sulfate to produce iron sulfate and copper, and then that copper will undergo electrolysis. But good question. Someone said that 2 people have raised their hands. If you've raised your hands, you can ask your questions in the Q&A section or in the chat box, whichever you prefer. Okay, so that's kind of concludes the part about the biological methods of extraction. So the next thing we're going to look at then are life cycle assessments. Someone's asking, what's the point of the hand raise function? We don't tend to use it in the webinars, but it can be used to tell us to unmute your mic, but we don't use it here. So if you do raise your hand, it usually tells us that you have a question that you want to be answered. Someone's saying iron sulfate undergoes electrolysis. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Okay, let's go on to life cycle assessments then. Now, this is a very, very small portion of all 3 of the exam board syllabus requirements. So it's important you understand it, but there's not much you need to know about it. And what I would say is try and keep it quite simple because it can get a bit confusing. So why do we do a life cycle assessment? Well, they are used to map all the environmental impacts of products, processes, or services from cradle to grave. So what that means is, if you think about a plastic bag, it's about the environmental impacts of producing that plastic bag from raw materials and then disposing of it once we've finished using that plastic bag. So once it's been reused plenty and plenty of times, it's maybe broken, we can't use it anymore, we dispose of it. So a life cycle assessment looks at the environmental impacts of the whole process going from when it's produced to when we then dispose of it. And there are 4 main stages involved. The first one is extracting and processing the raw materials needed. So that's what I talked about when we produce that plastic bag. Manufacturing the product and its packaging, using, reusing and maintaining the product, and then disposing of the product at the end of its useful life. So there are 4 main stages involved. Now, in exam questions, first of all, I want to say there is actually only 1 exam question that I've seen asked on this topic, and it's been for the AQA exam board. The reason for that is it's a relatively new topic. So it's very likely that if you're doing exams next year, it could come up in an exam question. The exam questions that people have made that aren't necessarily affiliated with the exam board, but people think could be produced, are all quite similar. So I'll show you how to answer those and what you need to know. But the first thing that's really important to understand are these four main processes. So the extraction, manufacturing, using, and then disposing of a product. And then what you want to think about at each stage with regard to its environmental impacts are the use of energy, the transport of materials, and any waste substances that are released into the atmosphere. So when we think about energy, when we use the product, do we require any energy to use the product? Is there any energy required when we're getting the raw material from the earth? When we're transporting the materials, is there any energy required? And then when we dispose of it, for example, does that require landfill? That's, again, it's an environmental impact. Does it release atmospheric pollutants when we use it? Things like that. They are all important to be thought about. Okay, someone is again saying they can't hear me. So can I just check, can people hear me? Someone's asking for the difference between IGCSE and GCSE. So IGCSE is usually the Cambridge Exam Board, and GCSE is just the name for the qualifications. Okay, great. So it seems that people can hear me. Someone's asking why there was no physics session this week. I'm not sure, but I can ask the MyTutor attendant that's here. I'm not sure, it might be tomorrow, but I'm not sure why there was no physics session this week. Oh, okay. So apparently there was one yesterday at 2 p.m. So I assume either you missed that or it will be coming up on YouTube, so you can see it on there. So let's look at a life cycle assessment then. So this is one that I drew. Again, it's just to show you what you would think about. It's not one based on any specific material or any product. It's just a symbol diagram showing you what you should think about at each stage. So raw materials. This is using up limited resources. So does it require that? So if we think about, let's think about an example. So let's think about a pillowcase cover. So a pillowcase cover, does anyone know a cotton pillowcase cover, does it use up limited resources? Where does cotton come from? Does anyone know? Good. Cotton comes from the cotton plant or the hibiscus plant. The hibiscus plant. Excellent. So actually it doesn't come from a limited resource. So if we were thinking about a cotton pillowcase cover, we wouldn't be thinking about limited resources, so it doesn't use that. And actually, when we use a cotton plant, hopefully you remember it's a renewable resource because we can plant more cotton plants. But maybe something it does do when we take that cotton is it damages habitats, and that might be because we have to uproot the cotton plant to use it. So potentially we're damaging habitats, although you could argue that when we replant them again, it'll be fine for the habitats in the areas. So that's what you think about with raw materials. Are we damaging habitats through quarrying, mining and chopping trees down, or are we using up limited resources? So in the instance of our cotton pillowcase, we only really need to think about damaging habitats potentially. Then we think about manufacturing it, so making the cotton pillowcase cover. So making cotton pillowcase cover, we will probably need machines. So we might need sewing machines in a big factory. That's going to require energy. Energy tends to come from fossil fuels. That's going to release greenhouse gases, as well as that use up non-renewable resources. There's labor involved as well. So that means manual labor, so people, human labor. So again, if we think about the humans actually getting to the factory, do they travel in cars? That's an environmental impact so that they can then do their job. Or is it all machines? Using up land for factories, it tends to be that a lot of these products are produced in factories, so that will use up land. And again, when we then erect those factories and when we build those factories, that's going to require energy. Yep, so I'm thinking about a pillowcase cover as an example product and taking it through a life cycle assessment so I can show you how we do that. We've thought about raw materials, we've thought about the manufacture. The next thing we think about then is use. So using a pillowcase then. So I'll tell you, this is the place where most of the energy is involved, or most of the environmental impact comes from. Does anyone know why? Why is it that pillowcase covers have the most environmental impact in its use? So if you think about any pillowcase covers that you're using in your home right now, why is it then that that's where most of the environmental impact comes from when we're actually using it? Any ideas? So think about when you're using it, what do you have to do to it? All of that. Excellent. Someone said wash it. Good, you're thinking on the right line. So washing is one environmental impact. Anything else we do to our pillowcase covers? So washing, anything else? Drying, good. Brilliant. So when we're using it, what we tend to have to do is wash and dry. Some people might iron their pillowcase covers, and all of those require a lot of energy. So making the pillowcase cover and getting the raw materials does not require that much because it's just a small pillowcase cover. It's not going to require as much energy, whereas we can tend to use our pillowcase covers for many, many years. And in those many years, some people will wash their pillowcases hundreds and thousands of times and also dry them lots and lots of times. And that requires a lot of energy. So there's energy involved in that. And again, most of our energy comes from fossil fuels. And also you'll know that when we burn our fossil fuels, we get atmospheric emissions. So we can actually see that with a pillowcase cover that's made of cotton, most of the life cycle assessment or most of the environmental impact will come from its use. The final aspect then is disposal. So once we're done with our pillowcase cover, we don't want to use it anymore. There are two things we can do with it. We either put it in a landfill site or we recycle and reuse it. So some people will go through a process of upcycling. So upcycling basically means using that product to make something else. So some people might make clothing from it, or it will go into landfill, which is actually where most of our pillowcase covers end up. So again, landfill sites, environmental impact is using up our land. We can't grow trees there. If we recycle it, that's always good, but remember recycling and things requires actually separating out all the recycled products. That requires energy as well as that human labor. And then if we reuse it, thinking about what we make to reuse the product, does that require energy? Are we using sewing machines again? So life cycle assessments literally just require you thinking about a product from its raw materials all the way through to its disposal. Does anyone have any questions on that? Someone's asking about disposable ones. Okay, so disposable ones will have a larger impact, not from use, but from disposal, because most disposable ones will actually end up in landfill. So they won't be reused again. So there'll be a large environmental impact from landfill sites. Yeah, I'm going to show you an exam question in just a second. Does anyone have any questions on life cycle assessments? Oh, okay, so someone's asking me, what's the conclusive name for phytomining and bioleaching? So we just call them biological methods of extracting. So they're called biological methods of extraction. Phytomining and bioleaching are the two types. Okay. So the final thing I want to cover then are just things that you have to think about when you're doing a life cycle assessment or when you're answering a question on a life cycle assessment. So usually products or processes or services are given an impact score. And what that means is you can compare two products together. So for example, if we had a plastic bag made of plastic versus, for example, a bag made of cotton, you might expect the impact score for the plastic bag to be a lot higher, meaning that it has a higher environmental impact than the bag made from cotton. So impact scores can be given. It's important to think about regional impacts, such as smog, as well as the national impacts. Now, what that means is regional impacts are things that happen in the local area. So next to factories, you're more likely to get a lot of smog released. And smog, don't forget, is just carbon particles. But nationally, factories release a lot of gases, so specifically atmospheric pollutants, and they will go into the atmosphere and cause global warming. So the national impact will be global warming, but in the region of the factory, you would expect smog. So it's important that you think about both of those when you're doing a life cycle assessment. Sometimes we need to make assumptions on the effects caused by the certain areas of the life cycle. So for example, if we don't know how we get the raw materials for something, we might just need to make assumptions on what we might do. As well as that, if we don't know how we dispose of something, we might have to make assumptions. And it's just making sure that you think about all the possible areas where there could be an environmental impact. The cycles themselves do not account for the performance or cost of the product, service, or process. And this is really important. So for example, a plastic bag is a lot cheaper than a cotton bag, but the cycles themselves don't take into account that because they only look at the environmental impact. They don't care about the cost of products, and they also don't take into account the performance. So what you might find is that a much cheaper product might not actually work as well compared to a much more expensive product. And again, it's about looking just at the environmental impact for life cycle assessments. Another kind of example would be that if, for example, you've got a product that has an impact score of 70 and a product that has an impact score of 20, you might expect that we'd actually go for the product that has an impact score of 20 because there's less of an environmental impact. But what if, for example, the performance of the product if we think about a battery, for example, if the performance of that battery that has an impact score of 20 is only 1 hour, whereas the one that has an impact score of 70 will last for months. Again, life cycle assessments don't allow you to take those into consideration. It's just about the environmental impact. And the final thing is that they can be very subjective because people carry them out, they think about all the impacts, but they might forget areas. As well as that, they might think that certain areas have more of an environmental impact than other areas. So it's important that actually lots of people carry them out, and that you reach a consensus. And consensus just means that you talk about them, or talk about each of the points together and reach an agreement between you on what the impact score should be. So before we do any exam questions, are there any questions then on the things to consider with life cycle assessments? Yep, someone's asking me to go to page 6. I will go there now. So this was just the process of phytomining. Okay, and page 13. I'm not sure, we haven't gone to page 13 yet. So anyway, let's go to page 12 actually before we do that. Okay, this is the only exam question currently available on life cycle assessments. So let's do this. Have a read of it. And as I said, there aren't any other questions out at the moment. It's an AQA question. It has come from the specimen paper, the 2018 specimen paper. So ethene is used to make polyethene. Polyethene is used to make plastic bags. Table 1 shows data from a life cycle assessment for a plastic bag and a paper bag. A company stated a life cycle assessment shows that using plastic bags has less environmental impact than using paper bags. Evaluate this statement. Use your knowledge and information from table 1. So what does evaluate mean? What does evaluate mean? Yeah, excellent. So discuss the advantages and disadvantages. So evaluate literally means look at both sides. Good. Okay then, so thinking about that. So this company has said that using plastic bags has less environmental impact than using paper bags. So pros and cons of that statement, or things for it and things against it. That's how I would think about it. So, so things that agree with this statement and things that disagree with that statement. So if we think about things that agree first, so what agrees with that statement? If we look at the table, I've got a plastic bag having less environmental impact than paper bags. What will agree with that statement? Any ideas? Good. So there is much less solid waste. Very good. So there's much less solid waste in plastic bags. And someone has also said the energy used is less. Good. Okay, so we can talk about there being less waste. So solid waste will tend to go into landfill. So less waste, which also means less use of landfill. Space. Good. Someone is saying that there is less CO2 produced. Brilliant. So less CO2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So less CO2 produced and therefore less of an impact on the environment, especially with regards to global warming. Anything else? What else agrees with that statement? So we're thinking about plastic bags, agreeing with that statement at the moment. We're not thinking about. Good. So we've talked about less solid waste. So yeah, less energy used. So less energy used. Energy tends to come from fossil fuels. Okay. Someone's asking me what's landfill. So landfill essentially means that there are areas of land in the UK and lots of countries where we literally just dump our waste. That place is called landfill. It's called a landfill site. So we just fill it with waste. Okay, so they are three statements that agree. Let's think about things that disagree then. What disagrees with that statement? So the statement is that a life cycle assessment shows that using plastic bags has less environmental impact than using paper bags. What do we think? Can we come up with 3 points that disagree with that statement? So someone has already said plastic bags are non-biodegradable. Good. So that is something that comes from your own knowledge, which is perfectly fine to use because it says use your own knowledge. So plastic bags are non-biodegradable. Good. Anything else? Paper bags are renewable. Excellent. You could argue that so are plastic bags. So I would be careful when saying that statement that paper bags are renewable because paper bags tend to break a lot more easily. Good. Plastic bags use crude oil while paper uses wood. And the key thing there as a linking statement is that wood is renewable. So wood is renewable, whereas crude oil is a non-renewable source and so will run out. Good. And you can also talk about the extraction process of crude oil requiring a lot of energy. So remember fractional distillation, all of that. Excellent. Yep, plastic bags are arguably a finite resource unless we make them from ethene from fermenting glucose. Good. Excellent. So we've come up with a couple of points there. So this is kind of what I would always do. When you're planning a 6-mark question, come up with a plan first. Think about things that agree with the statement, think about things that disagree with the statement, and then try and write it coherently and put it all together. So it's really important that you don't just state things, you actually try and have a linking point. So when we say there's less waste, it's important then you say, okay, if there's less waste, that means that there will be less use of landfill space. Less CO2 produced. Why is that a good thing? Well, it means that there's less of an impact on the environment because there's less global warming or there's less greenhouse gases emitted. So you just need to make sure you have a linking statement. So this is, as I said, the only question on life cycle assessments, and all they're making you do is compare a plastic bag to a paper bag. And this is specifically looking at the two processes of from the raw materials and manufacture. So you could have brought in disposal and use. So you could talk about using plastic bags doesn't actually require much energy, but paper bags tend to break a lot more easily. So you might need to replace them quite frequently, whereas that's not the case with plastic bags. And then disposal. So most plastic bags will actually end up in landfill. Paper bags can be recycled in the sense that they will not end up in landfill. They can be used for other products. Okay, so now let's do a question on copper. So metals are extracted from their ores. Many copper ores contain only 2% of copper compounds. Copper is now extracted from ores containing a low percentage of copper compounds, so from low-grade ores. Why do we now extract copper from low-grade ores? Any ideas? So why do we extract copper from low-grade ores? Good. Limited resources. Excellent. Any other questions? Any other answers? Excellent. So, yep. So the high grade ores are in less of a demand because there are fewer of them. So we want to use low grade ores because we have less high grade ores available. Excellent. Anything else? Why else do we now extract from ores containing low percentage of copper compounds? So it's more environmentally friendly. So I showed you phytomining and bioleaching are much more environmentally friendly. It really reduces the use of energy, it reduces atmospheric pollutants. So all of those would be good examples of answers there. Let's go on to another question then. Okay, what about this question here? So large areas of land are contaminated with copper compounds. Phytomining can be used to remove these copper compounds from the land. What is used in phytomining to remove copper compounds from the land? So does anyone remember what was it? The process of phytomining requires what? What is it that, what removes those copper compounds from the ores in phytomining? So the first step of the process, what is it? Yeah, great. So growing plants, So excellent, good, growing plants. Okay. So the percentage of copper ore in the contaminated land is low. So if we have a read here, so copper is found in the Earth's crust as an ore containing copper sulfide. Large areas of land where this ore was quarried are contaminated with low percentages of copper sulfide. Copper would be too expensive to extract from this contaminated land using the traditional method of quarrying and then heating in a furnace. So we talked about that. Why is it too expensive to extract it using the traditional method? Why do we not want to extract from low-grade ores? Does anyone know? Why is it too expensive? Yeah, there's not enough copper. So because there's not enough copper, it's not cost effective to use the traditional methods. You end up releasing too much energy, using too much energy and releasing too many atmospheric pollutants for a very small amount of copper. Okay, extracting copper from this land by the traditional method would have a major environmental impact. So we've just talked about that. So using a lot of energy requires the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels release carbon dioxide when they're burnt. That contributes to global warming. So anything like that would be fine for the answer there. Okay, this is a interesting question. So one way to extract the copper from the land that contains low percentages of copper sulfide is by bioleaching. Bioleaching uses bacteria, so we went through the process of bioleaching, and the bacteria produces a solution of copper sulfate. So remember I said that they produce this acidic solution by breaking down the ores. It is possible to get copper from a solution of copper sulfate using scrap iron. It is economical to use scrap iron to get copper. So why? Why is it economical to use scrap iron? So that process is displacement, but why is it economical to use scrap iron? So economical means we're thinking about cost. So if they ever ask you something to do with the economy or economical, it's about cost. So we don't want to think about energy. We want to think about why is it economical to use iron? Excellent. So yeah, so iron itself is cheap. And because iron is cheap, that means it's economical to use scrap iron in displacement reactions. And remember, scrap iron means that it doesn't tend to get used. So it will tend to be really, really cheap. People don't want to use scrap iron. It tends to be waste iron. So if you think about it that way, that's why iron is really cheap. Excellent. So well done today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session. So just as a quick kind of summary of what we did. So we looked at the extracting of copper using from high-grade ores. We then described the biological methods of metal extraction, and then we looked at the concept of life cycle assessments. If you've got any last minute questions, please pop them into either the Q&A or the chat now. If not, I will see you next Thursday at the same time at 2 p.m. Where we'll be carrying on looking at the Earth's resources. Take care, everyone. Have a lovely week, and I will see you next week. Bye.